Investors get wiped out when they obsess over headlines and miss the context. Meanwhile, the greatest investors in the world look at today's headlines through the lens of history, giving them perspective and insight that most people miss. Today, I'm sitting down with the author of a book that has provided timeless insights into the rise and fall of empires. Stephen Bown is the author of Merchant Kings and about half a dozen other amazing books. And today we dive into some of the stories of the greatest entrepreneurs and companies that shaped our world and what we can apply from those lessons to today. Welcome to the Jay Martin Show, where we dissect the greatest minds in geopolitics and finance. Here is Stephen R. Bown. Enjoy.
This is Jay Martin.
Here I am with Stephen Bown. Stephen, thanks so much for making the time. I'm really looking forward to chatting with you today.
Yeah, me as well. It should be good.
So I just finished your book, Merchant Kings, and everybody who watches my show should order a copy because you'll love it. This documents a period of history when, as Stephen describes, when companies ruled the world. And he picks off about 5 entrepreneurs and walks you through their journey of how they shaped the modern world. And you'll get a taste of the Dutch Empire, the British Empire, the founding of Canada, the Russian America Company, and South Africa. He covers, the whole globe, and it's fascinating. And, as an investor, specifically a raw materials commodity investor, the reason I study history is because we, as investors, can get so bent out of shape with the near-term headlines, like what happened last week, what happened this week, and often people adjust portfolios and make decisions off of that, forgetting the long-term trend. And I try to bury myself in history so that I'm always coming back to that, Stephen. And, I've heard you speak about this before. Being a historian gives you context and helps you understand the real significance of maybe what's going on today. Because so much of what's happening seems unprecedented, right? You could look at today's landscape and say, there's unprecedented political activity, unprecedented military activity, unprecedented civil unrest, whatever it is, and maybe unprecedented in recent memory. And in some cases, unprecedented in my entire lifetime. But if you go back a bit further, you'll find that we're sort of watching the same movie on repeat, right? And if you study the sunset years of the British Empire, the Dutch Empire, the Spanish Empire, you'll see a lot of the same activities and behaviors that we're seeing today. Let's just start with that. What's your take on what I just shared, Stephen?
Well, I mean, you're exactly right. I mean, all these, you go back centuries in time and take a broad view of things. I mean, the same crap just happens over and over again in cycles. It seems like, and there's a recent book called The Fourth Turning, or the Fourth Turning is Upon Us, and I forget the name of the author now, but I read that one. He characterized human historical societies, especially in Europe and America, as being on more or less 100-year cycle. And according to his thesis, and I believe that he more or less proved it, is that, the fourth turning would be exactly where we are right now, a period of intense chaos and disagreement and a lack of unity between, groups of people. And there's no middle ground. No one wants a middle ground. Everyone's kind of willing to scrap and fight, and everything's trying to splinter apart. The last fourth turning, of course, was the 1930s and the 1940s that led up to World War II. And he took it back another century. And so the previous fourth turning would have been the American Civil War. And then you go back even further and there's the American War of Revolution. And you go back even further and you get your English Civil War, and the battles between the religions. And then you go back even further and there's, the Spanish Armada invading England, and the Protestants and the Catholics. I mean, they've traced this back many, many centuries. And, as soon as I read that, it was only a year ago, I think I read that. And I was like, crap, here we are on the fourth turning again. And, it's exactly what he says. I mean, and he predicts that it's going to culminate sometime at the end of this decade, according to their more, they don't have precise dates. They're more talking about the tenor in society and how it goes more like a sine wave rather than investment charts where it goes up and spikes up and down, up and down and down. This one sort of curves, like gentle waves. And as we transition into the culmination of the fourth turning, it's like, no, I mean, but everything seems to be following that pattern, ripping everything apart. And of course, following the fourth turning is the first turning, which is a great deal of social cohesion, maybe a little bit of stifling stifling of artistic creativity and a lack of interest in diverse cultural or social opinions, but material prosperity. Think the 1950s, right? And then, of course, that's followed by the second turning, which would be, the kids from the first turning say, what the hell, this is really boring crap you people live. We're not going to live like that. We're going to go and join rock bands and, have theater troupes traveling all over the place. We need to explore our spiritual aspect and blah, blah, blah. Think the 1960s. And then the more cynical third turning is where the, people, and that would be my generation. I'm 57 right now, grew up in an era where, the idealism of the first turning of material prosperity and social cohesion is revealed to be a bit of a not quite as utopian as you'd imagine. The second turning, all of that stuff is like, come on, man, you've taken it too extreme. This is kind of silly. We're very cynical. And as soon as I read that, I was like, that's exactly me. And that's my whole take on everything. And it permeates everything that I write, as a cynical look at, or a sideways look at things rather than a rah-rah cheering of a nationalism or a takedown or anything. And then, of course, we get into the fourth turning. And in history, just like you were, alluding to earlier, all this easily can invest how the economy works and the people's entire view on the world that they see around them, because they're born into these turnings. And unless you take a great deal of time and effort into learning about past eras, you're kind of stuck with what's going on around you, which is kind of like, I don't know how many people ride mountain bikes or dirt bikes or downhill ski, but it's like not looking far enough ahead on the trail, and all you see is a couple of feet in front of you. It's very hard to react to things. I think studying history gives you a bit of a perspective to take a longer view and realize that a lot of this stuff is all happened before. Now, of course, it doesn't mean there's not going to be the good and the bad and the ugly coming, but at least you could somewhat perhaps anticipate it a little bit, or position yourself a little bit more defensively, or put your life into perspective a bit more.
Mm-hmm. Now, I got to ask you, having studied so many of those periods of history independently and then reading Neil Howe's book, The Fourth Turning, what are your thoughts on why the timing is what it is? Why is it around 100 years that we seem to mature through these four stages again and again and again? I mean, intuitively, it makes sense that we maybe begin in some kind of very aligned, as you mentioned, there's not a lot of individualism in the first turning, right? It's a very collectivist, unified community at this point. And that breeds rebels who want to step out and express themselves into the second turning. This is artistic expression. And, we maybe take it a bit to the limits, right? Which leads to the third turning where we get a bit cynical about maybe divisions and and if you follow kind of the wealth story along, this is often where you see a lot of wealth gaps and wealth divisions that lead to more of that cynicism and division, which ends up in the fourth turning, which is the irreconcilable unrest and divisions that brings you back, usually in the empire cycle under, unfortunately, the guise of authoritarian rule that people vote for because of how unorganized everything, chaotic everything is. The divisions are too deep. The unrest is too strong. And so people call for a strong authoritarian style leader to bring them back again. And that's often what you see in the country level. But what's your take on the timing of that? Why is it 100 years? Is that kind of like the, two sort of well-lived lives, the productive years of two people? And do you think there's anything different this time? And that's what everyone will say, like, oh, it's different this time because AI. It's different this time because, America is the last of the recent Christian empires, and now it's all up in the air and all this. What's your take, Stephen?
I don't think anything's ever different this time. All those new technologies are just tools, and we use tools for our own to realize our own ambitions. And so, whatever the tool is, it's going to be deployed in a manner that that we decide to use it for as humans to achieve other aspects of our life. So, right now it might be AI and interconnectedness and this ability to have drone technology. I mean, some of these things are upending how, warfare is fought, or how, if there's going to be cyber wars, how you can just take down entire grids of communication or electricity or utilities or whatever, with cyber warriors doing it instead of, troops on the ground. This might seem revolutionary, but those are just like the tactics in the greater war. They're still trying to achieve the same objectives. And, when I wrote my book on the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway in Canada in, the 1860s to 1880s, I was really struck by how the revolutionary invention of dynamite completely that was the technology at that time that completely transformed the world and ushered in an era of mass industrialization. Think of everything that we imagine as modern societies: the ability for harbors to have giant ships, the ability to have roads, the ability to have railroads and tunnels and bridges, and all the civic infrastructure that enabled. We take all the civic infrastructure completely for granted now. But before 1866, when dynamite was invented by Alfred Nobel, all of that was basically impossible, because dynamite had about 10 times the blasting capacity of old black powder or gunpowder that people used to use. And with boreholes, you could drill it into the side of mountainsides and blast outwards. So all of a sudden you could accomplish things that were people never even dreamed of doing that before. Why didn't they dream of it? Because the capacity for doing it was impossible. It's like, right. But as soon as the technology exists, it opened up the human capacity for imagining a different future. And so that's why we had all this railroad development. It wasn't just because people decided, let's have some railroads. That's a cool idea. Yeah. It was because the technology, all of a sudden, it's like, wow, all of a sudden, we can pursue different objectives. And that transformed the economy. All of a sudden, there was bulk transport of commodities back and forth. And you could have regions which previously had little economic value to a larger society were all of a sudden opened up. Like imagine, the Canadian prairies and all the wheat that was coming from there. Well, that was impossible if you had no way to get it to any kind of a market. So when you look at the world, there's different eras, and different technology really ushers in the change. And getting back to your original question, I think, it's a combination of technology that enables people's imaginations, and it's the natural inclination to do something within a certain segment of the population, to do something different than, our parents, and to set off on a different path in life, whether that path is a literal path like it would have been in the past, setting off to, start a new, new tribe into a new valley, explore something. This human idea that we need to explore new frontiers, whether those are, physical frontiers or psychological frontiers, whatever it is, there's a certain group of people that want to set off and do different things from what is being done in their society. And if their society that they live in is too entrenched or too static, they'll just head off in a different direction. And so I think the turnings are just the generations battling back against each other, and the natural inclination to want to do something different. And I think Howe was talking about that in his book a little bit, and that's probably where. Anyway, that's the most logical explanation, but there's no doubt that it does seem to go in this 100-year cycle.
You said a couple of things there I just want to pull on. One, you said, why didn't people dream of this? Well, they didn't, because they didn't have the capacity to do it. And you're right. We're unable to make that. We couldn't have dreamed of reading a book before the printing press was invented, right? We couldn't have dreamt of sending an email before the internet was invented. The bridge is too far, which I love, because I have a similar response when people say it's different this time because, and they'll usually point to AI. They say, we've never seen a technology moving this fast that is this disruptive before. And maybe that's the case, or maybe that's just the technology of the day. And maybe the printing press was just as disruptive. And you could make that argument that it absolutely was. Same with the internet, same with the electricity, right? But what you said is that the tools in our hand change, but the human holding that tool, their nature is the same. It's the same person.
Yeah.
Right? And that is the constant.
And look, in the 16th century, the idea just popped in my head as you mentioned. The 16th century was naval technology accomplishing the same thing. Certain European nations were able to, hack down several thousand oak trees and manufacture them into these giant ships that had hundreds of different sails all over it and hundreds of people working on it. And with those things, all of a sudden they could cross oceans. Well, had never been done before in thousands of years of human history. So that was completely disruptive technology too. Going back, we're going back 500-600 years here now. And it's just another example of a completely revolutionary technology that upended how the world was viewed. It upended commerce. It upended politics. It was a massive shift of a balance of power shift towards certain nations from other ones. And so, at the time, people also thought about those ships and about that technology and about their capacity to do things, to dream about trade networks, to dream about conquering foreign nations that they didn't even, whole continents didn't even know to exist before that. And it was only this technology allowed it to enter into the human psyche that, hey, we should go over there and do something, either attack it or trade with it or whatever the inclination is of the day. And all these technologies have the same thing, the same impact on our ability to imagine the world. And AI is pretty darn powerful. I mean, my son's doing a computer science degree right now, and its ability to ask questions if you're unclear about something. Well, it takes about 30 seconds, and the answer can come up. Now, it's not always completely accurate, but it's a very powerful tool for accomplishing a lot of the things that are going on in society right now.
Yeah. And the naval technology example is so good because we did explore and effectively discover entire new worlds, right? That's what was discovered on the other side of the ocean.
Yeah.
Today it's like, that's silly, obviously, but no, at the time that was absolutely the case. And that not knowing, so there's this, I love this. George Washington died in 1799, and the first dinosaur fossil was discovered in 1824, which means that George Washington lived his entire life having never heard of a dinosaur. Like things that we don't, and it's hard to wrap your mind around that, but like,
yeah, that's true. Yeah.
That was it, right?
Yeah.
And the things we don't know can just dwarf us, but we don't feel it because we don't know those things.
I mean, I think that's one of the things that's missing in a lot of the understanding of society in the world today is the lack of appreciation for history and how change happens over time. And, in certain people's minds, there's an idea that, the past is exactly the same as it was now, except people were, less enlightened or more colonial or more white supremacist or whatever the criticism might be. But as a historian who looks back at this all the time, I think, no, the past is a completely different place. It's like going to a foreign country. The customs will all be different. The language will be different. The food will be different. The expectations on you will be different. When you look back at the past, it's not the same as what it was now. The world was constrained by their technology and by their worldview and by their geographic knowledge about the sailing ships is what opened up the rest of the world. For centuries before that, people had no idea. Most people lived their lives within, I believe I've read this somewhere, 20 miles of where they were born. And almost no one ever left that. Mm. I mean, that's inconceivable. Most of us commute to our jobs in cities, greater distance to that, twice a day.
Yeah.
On the weekend, we drive further than that to go skiing or biking or whatever it is we end up doing in our spare time. I mean, obviously we wouldn't do that if we had to walk. And, even horses were a revolutionary technology. And the idea that you could build the Roman Empire, which conquered most of Europe and all around the Mediterranean, built out these cobblestone paths and roads everywhere. Well, before that, everything was going on cross country where it was giant mud. So, you go back another 1,000 years before sailing ships and you have the first interconnected, system of trade routes and paths that had some civil engineering back behind them. And that completely transformed that world too. So the world is always changing. And you're never going to understand our present society unless you understand how we got here and how change is incrementally happening all the time. And every now and then it speeds up, or it seems to speed up. And people imagine, everything's different now. Nothing's the same. But I just don't subscribe to that. I mean, people in the past were biologically exactly the same as us. They just were products of a different environment and a different, their minds were expanded or constrained or however you want to think of their worldview by the world that they lived in. And ours is right now exactly like that too. I mean, we don't know. In several generations, either we'll be back in the Stone Age because people will blow everything to bits, and we'll, go back several stages of technology, or, Elon Musk's latest rocket is going to suddenly take off and we'll be colonizing Mars. I mean, we don't know. There's all kinds of stuff going on, and even for someone like you who's plugged into a lot of financial developments around the world, I mean, we still don't know. There's all kinds of things happening in secret. There's 8 billion people on the planet, and the capital flows that are going all around the place that are funneling this and funneling that, and the scientists working on this and the people developing that. And it's all opaque unless something is suddenly revealed as being successful. It's like a card in a card game. Unless the card is deployed, it's hidden. We don't know what technologies are being developed right now. We could next month open up Wall Street Journal or something and read this article about someone who's invented the cure for this, or the solution to that problem, the solution to the energy problem, or the battery problem, or they solved cancer or whatever. And the whole world will be completely changed again, right? So,
oh man. Yeah. Okay, a few threads I want to pull on. And before I do, just because you mentioned, horses as being a novel technology, and, one of the core reasons America looks the way it does today is because of horses and the Comanches, when they harnessed this technology, largely stolen from the Spanish settlers at the time. But, the Comanches were like a forgotten band that were small and uncompetitive and had been pushed to the desolate canyons of Mexico and present day New Mexico. It was the Navajo and the Apaches that had the prairies, until the Comanches stole and traded for a bunch of horses over many years from the Spanish. They mastered this craft and then exploded out of the canyons and completely took over the heart of the country. And for about 100 years, this is the Comanche Empire. And they were so robust that the Spanish weren't able to get past them to move north. The French weren't able to get out of present day Louisiana. And it really shaped how the country looks today. That's why you have French influence there and Spanish influence there. But there's barriers to that because they couldn't get past the Comanches at the time.
That's really cool. I didn't know that. That's really cool.
Well, and they were a band that was not competitive for their entire existence until the Spanish brought horses over. And then, as you mentioned, this disruptive technology, they harnessed it. And fascinating piece of American history. So you mentioned one thing here, another thing. You said, how much of our present day political system, military system, financial system is opaque, right? How much we don't know. And I think that's important to pull on because that's kind of been the theme of our conversation thus far. There's a lot that we don't know that dwarfs us. Your book, Merchant Kings, was written about the era of state-sponsored capitalism. We talked about the Dutch East India Company. They wouldn't have been able to dominate the spice trade like they did without the monopoly the Dutch government gave them, provided military support and capital. British East India Company, the same. They wouldn't have overthrown the Celestial Empire in China or colonized India if they didn't have the state-sponsored capitalist machine working for them, right? Complete with military support and all of this. The Russia-American Company, which colonized Alaska. And actually, I'd love your take on this. I'm going to go down so many rabbit holes here, but I'll get back to the thread, I promise. But I'd love your take on this. So Alexander Baranov, who was running the Russia-America Company, who sailed across the Bering Strait, did a bunch of deals with the Alouettes and colonized Alaska, and then continued down the West Coast as far as California and put down a bunch more Russian forts along the way. And he was very successful in that endeavor, and simultaneously was doing deals with the kings in Hawaii. Now, you could read his life story, look at his successful colonization of Alaska, which is why America ended up buying it from the Russians. And you could say if this guy had 10 more years, I mean, the only reason he didn't complete his mission down the entire West Coast through to Southern California and Hawaii is because he ran out of years. He got a late start to his career. I don't think he got to Alaska until he was like 40. And then by his 60s, crippling arthritis, all of this. This guy, if he had 10 more years, the North American map might look very different from how it does today because he reasonably would have been successful colonizing the entire West Coast and Hawaii. What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, that's a really good observation. I mean, it's probably true. I mean, I never thought of it that way, but it's true. We all have human lifespans. I mean, I mean, look at Trump right now. Isn't he 80 years old or 79? And people are saying, oh,
Like,
he's going to go,
yeah.
he's going to go for a third term or whatever. And I'm thinking, well, I know some people who are 84 years old, my parents, and they're not going to be, that the lifespan kind of limits what our ambitions, whatever they are, could be. And, the Russian American company, that's right. They conquered all that land. But he was the driving force behind that. No one else behind him had the flame or the vision or the capacity, the leadership capacity, to do that. And then another funny observation on that is the only reason that they had any interest in colonizing that land and taking it over as the monopoly branch of the Russian government is because sea otters were extremely valuable in China at the time. When that's just weird to think of. Why these things were their weight in gold almost, a sea otter pelt, because the emperors wore them, and therefore people who wanted to emulate the emperors also wore them. So it's fashion is what drove the Russian conquest of large chunks of Western North America. I mean, it makes you throw your hands up and go, what the, how, why? And it's the same with the Dutch East India Company and the English East India Company going over to, India and Indonesia and those islands. I mean, they were searching after dried plant matter, nutmegs and cloves. And I think, well, why was a nutmeg? We buy a nutmeg for 15 cents at the grocery store, and you can grate it on your meal, whether you want to or not. But back then, a nutmeg was, if you had a nutmeg, you'd have a special thousands of dollar nutmeg grinder that you'd prominently display in the center of your table and invite your guests over to impress them that you were going to pass the nutmeg grinder around on their plates. And this was a real thing for them. Like, oh, a nutmeg. Wow, these people are really important. They're showing me some real respect. They must be really successful, and I want to be part of their circle. They have a nutmeg grinder on their table, and I get to put nutmeg on my potatoes or whatever. Potatoes themselves, a crop that comes from Peru. So, like all these funny, weird things come together. What's value? Why do we think is value as human beings? I mean, how do we attribute value? I mean, look at the prices people pay for ancient artworks from hundreds of years ago. I mean, for some people, that's a great store of value. They're going to pay millions of dollars, for a prominent artwork from someone famous that's been discovered. You go, wow, all that is a bunch of pigment smeared on a piece of canvas. Anyone can look at it because all these things are online. So it can't be just that you want to look at it. It's that you want to have the actual physical one there, and you want to bring some people over and show them, here, come and look at my Picasso that I got. Aren't I impressive that I have this thing? And whether it's dried plant matter or whether it's pigment on a piece of canvas or whether it's a pelt of a sea otter. I mean, the quest for these things, or beavers in Canada, the Hudson's Bay Company ended up taking big chunks of North America and the Pacific Northwest of the United States, all because beaver pelts were useful for making hats in Europe, and hats were a symbol of fashion and social hierarchy. And, so that drove this massive economic expansion and conquest of large chunks of the North American continent. I mean, all these things are frivolous and silly. And it kind of makes you think, like, what is it right now that's equally frivolous and silly? In 100 years from now, people are going to look back on our age and go, man, these people were kind of silly, All this quest, all this effort towards this ridiculous, foolish thing that we don't even think is valuable anymore.
And we will always disagree with that statement and say, no, this is important, right?
Yeah.
The issue, this is different, And I love it because you're right. The wars that were fought over pepper were as violent and consequential as the wars we fought over oil. Now, not as destructive on a mass scale because the military technology wasn't quite there, but doesn't matter. All of the principles are the same. We went to war for nutmeg. We've gone to war for rubber, for tobacco. Yeah. As you mentioned, for beaver pelts and a beaver felt hat, it was so valuable. It was passed down through generations like a Rolex today, but that was the case. And they're so ephemeral, our obsessions, however. And so when we think back, it's like, we were so silly back then, but today oil's important, right? And often I get, we look at the current trade wars occurring in sort of the shuffling of the geopolitical chessboard in real time. And, I've had some people ask me, do you think there's a possibility that one day, we would go to war for nickel or cobalt or copper? And it's like, no, we wouldn't do that. You know, we go to war for oil, right? But quick glance through history, it's like we went to war for pepper.
Yeah. And
we went to war for bananas, the banana wars of the 18th century, right? That happened.
We also went to war for saltpeter, you know, which is in Bengal. The French and the English were fighting over that region in India. The reason they wanted to fight over that is because they had a lot of cattle. Hindus were not eating the cattle. They had them for other purposes, but there was a lot of them, and they were breeding in the boiling hot sun there, all their urine and their excrement in this very fertile area. You scrape that and you get the saltpeter out of it. So there's a whole a lower caste of Indian society was responsible for creating the saltpeter from the urine and the excrement from all their cattle. And that was forming the ballast in the ships of all these companies that were there and shipped back to Europe. And of course, saltpeter is the main component in gunpowder. And so the French and the English were battling over that area of India because they wanted to get control of the saltpeter, which they needed for their wars in the 17th, 18th century. So, I mean, they're fighting over urine and crap. I mean, you know, like, it's just kind of funny, you know. And there's a famous naval battle just before World War I off the coast of Chile. I forget the names of the people involved, but it was British and German. You wonder what are British and German warships doing off the Pacific coast of Chile in 1913? Well, they were battling over control of the Kalish, is what they called it, and that was the centuries of accumulated bird guano on all those islands that were there, and they were scraping that off to get saltpeter because they needed that for the World War I. There was no synthetic nitrogen, and nitrogen, you need that for any kind of explosives. You also need it for fertilizer, which is one of the great ironies. And it was, you know, that drove the German scientist Fritz Haber to develop a synthetic form of nitrogen in World War I. And that's what kept Germany in the war, was he came up with this idea. And Karl Bosch was an engineer who scaled up his invention. And that's what kept the Germans in the war. They thought the war was going to be over really quickly because, well, all we had to do was shut the Germans off from access to, you know, the nitrogen or Kalish or saltpeter or whatever you want to call it, right? But the synthetic nitrogen prolonged the war for many, many years. And of course, the great irony is that after the war, that technology was then deployed as fertilizer. And that's why populations have quadrupled since that time. Because there used to be a nitrogen cycle that regulated human population to how much fertilizer you could use to grow crops. And it was the nitrogen cycle. So by cracking the nitrogen cycle, you just have the synthetic stuff. You toss it all over the place, right? I mean, that's where China's rice production all comes from, massive nitrogen dumped all over their rice fields, which of course drains down into the ocean and kills the fisheries. But that's a different story. You know, like, hey, all these things have their pros and cons, but it's weird little things like that, you know, huge hinges of history have turned upon seemingly ridiculous things like bird trap or pepper or nutmeg or the felt of certain fur animals that are.
Yeah. So, okay. So you going back to a comment you made about the opaque nature of our finance system, but I think we could expand that to maybe our political system as well. Here's why that struck me, Stephen, because your book, Merchant Kings, documents the time when companies ruled the world, right? And really from like 1600 to 1900 is the era that you covered. And this really is unignorable. This is an era where state-sponsored capitalism drove change and shaped our world. So my question for you is, what sort of confidence do you have that we've actually departed that era today, that the era of state-sponsored capitalism did end at the turning of the 20th century? Or are we in an era where it's just easier to be covert and we as a public are less aware of the state-sponsored capitalism that exists today, but it exists all the same as it did through the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries? And I guess bolting onto that question, we may be unaware of how tied in the state and mega corporations are today in terms of global conquest but maybe the British were just as unaware at the time and the Dutch were just as unaware at the time. And it's always been this way. And eventually in 300 years, someone's going to write a new book called Merchant Kings, the era when companies ruled the world, 1900 to, 300 years later. What's your take?
Yeah. I mean, that's a really interesting philosophical question. I mean, I love to think about things like that. I mean, it's true that the era of the Merchant Kings, I mean, using, these companies, the nations in Europe specifically, were using, the monopoly system, the creation of those giant global monopolies with the technology of the ships to sail across the ocean. They were the only ones that had that. And by granting them monopolies, they were effectively tapping private capital to pursue national objectives. And they were remarkably successful at that, until they came upon, some of the downsides when these companies, as soon as they left the shores of their home nation, there was no communication. They had the ships, but they didn't have any communication with them. So, a big ship would leave, let's say, London or Amsterdam or wherever, right? And it would set off. It would be gone for years. And during that time, there was absolutely no oversight of anything they did, no communication with them, and there was no one reporting back on what was happening. And when they got, let's say, to Indonesia or India or anywhere else, their technology level, whether it was guns and ships, well, the main ones, so exceeded anything that they encountered when they were there that they immediately dominated these societies. And the local rulers couldn't oppose them. And, it was only a short period of time, like, say, the Robert Clive and his conquest of India. I mean, this happened within a couple of decades. All of a sudden, a private corporation based in England, based in London, using private capital with an objective of increasing shareholder value, ended up as the political force that completely controlled massive part of the subcontinent of India. But at home, hardly anyone knew what was going on. So, it raises the question, like, what do we not know now that's going on? Because back then, I mean, most people were probably illiterate anyway and had little knowledge. There was no news system. There was no way to disseminate information to anyone. And effectively, these big monopoly corporations, they controlled the narrative because no one knew what they were doing when they got over there unless they said so. So they returned, they could announce payments to their shareholders. They could announce things to the government. Yes, we're doing this, we're doing that. Yeah, we're promoting Christianity. Don't worry. They can tell the priestly class, we're doing our objectives. But really, what they did was entirely up to them. And they controlled it. By controlling the narrative, they controlled the ability for themselves to be policed in any meaningful sense. And are corporations doing that these days? Well, I'm sure some of them are. I mean, look, people are not the same. They're not any different. I mean, we're all the same. And the same type of people find themselves in the same type of roles as they did in the past. And why would certain people be pursuing different objectives now? They might say that they're doing something different. There's a lot more oversight on what they do, but I'm sure there's a great deal of potential to sort of conceal their intentions or to, in some way corner the market over certain things that they imagine are going to be valued. But there's so many of these people, and they're very, very intelligent. And they're not evil people. They're just very narrowly focused on pursuing objectives. Like what about cobalt? I think it's cobalt. That's the one that's in
Congo.
Congo. Yeah, I mean, most of the world's cobalt is contained there, and there's child laborers working in rivers hand mining this stuff. I mean, cell phones, batteries, I mean, this stuff is extremely valuable. But how can there not be some kind of global conflict or flashpoint over access to that at some time? If let's just say one country took it over, went over, sailed some ships down there and conquered the place and restricted the shipment of that to a different country. How could they not respond? Without some of these key commodities, they would be completely crushed. Mm-hmm. You would lose your ability to communicate. You would lose your ability to function as a modern society. And then, I don't know. There's so much of that going on. I mean, I always listen to the podcasts of Peter Zeihan, and I read his book on, was on deglobalization. And I think what did he call the end of the world is now? Can't
Just
really
the beginning.
just the beginning. Yeah, I mean, I thought that was so interesting because I didn't know about materials culture. I didn't know how complex supply lines were until I read that. And as soon as I read that, I went, "Wow, man! I'm here looking at the surface of the ocean and seeing the wind is blowing some choppy waves and there's some leaves going on it. And by reading that book, it's like I put on a pair of goggles and I looked beneath it and saw the coral with all the exotic fish sailing around beneath the water. I mean, there's so much that's not visible unless you somehow gain the ability to look at it. And even then, just being aware of how complex it is enough to almost to scare me how easily to destroy that, like with all these severe, like the tariffs that Trump is putting on the whole world. I mean, this is a massively complex web of interconnected exchange of ideas and commodities, and how, Zion was talking about how pick something. It's usually mined in one place in the world, shipped somewhere else to be processed, shipped somewhere else to be added to other components, shipped somewhere else to be manufactured into a part, and then shipped somewhere else for that part to be assembled with a bunch of other parts into a product like a phone or something, and then shipped from there back to the people that are consuming it, us. And I was writing a bit about that also in my book on the railway, when everyone was, there was a huge famine and a starvation on the prairies when the buffalo completely died. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for why the buffalo died off. But there used to be 100 million of those things, and they went to almost zero by the early 1880s. And that caused a massive, widespread famine of tens of thousands of people all over the U.S., indigenous people all over the U.S. and in Canada. All of a sudden, their food source they had relied on for, forever, really, completely disappeared. And sometimes there are people say, well, why would they rely so strongly on one thing? Shouldn't they have known better? And I'm just thinking, well, look, our entire society runs on digital communication technologies, cell phones in one sense. We all have this like portable mini computers in our pockets that are extremely powerful, and they connect us to everything and everyone that we know. You can't even park your car around my town now without downloading an app and entering it in if your car is parked there, because that's the only way to pay. You can't even walk over and hand some money to someone. You have to have a cell phone. I mean, these things control our entire society. So much runs on that. And yet we don't make any of those here. We don't make any of the components of it here. We don't assemble it here. We don't process the raw materials for it. It all comes from other places, and we're trading stuff with other people to get it. But if that relationship breaks down, I mean, it's so delicate with the dozens of different points of potential conflict anywhere around the world. If any little component of that extremely complex web breaks down, we're kind of screwed in some ways. So it does worry me a little bit when I see like messing around with things that I think they're so complex that hardly anyone really appreciates or understands all the different connections that go. I mean, how could you? Our brains are only a certain size. So,
yeah. And your comment on the buffalo, it was a key strategy to finally defeating the Comanches. Back to the Comanches. I love that part of history, but they were such a tough enemy to beat, or a tough adversary to beat, because the Comanche Empire was a decentralized empire. It was hundreds of tribes that self-governed but identified as Comanche. And so when the Texas Rangers would do a deal with the Comanche chief, they thought they were doing a deal with the Comanches, but really it was just this one little pocket. And eventually they effectively starved them out of the prairies by decimating the buffalo populations. And therefore they'd surrender and enter the reservations because they had no other option, right? It was land of the buffalo was what sustained that society for so long. Okay, here's an area that I have been paying a bit more attention to lately in the theme of, covert operations, opaque operations. We're in this new era of warfare right now, I feel, and it's the era of proxy warfare. Now, if you look at like the trajectory of interstate wars, meaning country A declares war on country B. It's like a fairly steady curve until about World War II. And then it really falls off a cliff. But what picks up at that time is civil wars. If you look at a chart of civil wars over the same sort of 200-year time period, they're very steady until World War II. And then they take off about the same, if not even sharper, than interstate wars fall. And the core reason for that is that, when World War II entered, we entered the Cold War, and we had two global superpowers, both of who were nuclear powers, therefore neither one of which wanted to challenge the other to a direct war. And so instead they started funding proxy wars all over the globe to covertly take territory. Think the Chinese Civil War, that was sort of the first and the biggest, the Soviets versus the Americans, the People's Republic of China versus the Republic of China. And obviously the Soviets won that battle. The American-backed Chinese retreated to Taiwan, and that's sort of the stalemate of civil war. But the same in Afghanistan, same in Vietnam, same in Korea, right? That's North Korea and South Korea divided, right? And it was the Soviets backing North Korea and the Americans backing South Korea. Anyways, the reason was, that was the Cold War. It was two countries that didn't want to declare war on each other. But even since the Cold War's ended, these have only increased. And the reason is like, it's far more palatable than declaring an open war on somebody. It's far cheaper to finance, some militias or rebels or guerrillas in a country than to actually send soldiers in. And so it's a cheaper, more palatable way of declaring war. And if you look at the chart of interstate wars globally, they've fallen off a cliff, but the world doesn't seem like it's more at peace than ever. It's because these wars are fought covertly today. And I don't see a way that changes. Stephen, did I explain that? I'm sort of crafting this thesis, these days at my desk. And so I might have given you a half-baked idea here.
No, that's a really interesting idea. Yeah, I mean, look at it all. I mean, it's much easier to destabilize a country by funding internal conflict than it is to try and invade them yourself. Because think of the damage you can do. There's always conflicts in society. And probably more so, as we were talking about during the fourth turning, when people don't want to agree with each other, you could, amplify the different sides against each other by...
Yes. And that's the amplification is the real strategy. There's a bit of civil unrest and division, and then two superpowers provide weapons, money, and they amplify that conflict into something much greater, and that becomes a civil war, but it's a proxy war.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think that's a really good idea. Obviously that's what's happening in Ukraine. I mean, all the different people are the different sides sending their weapons and their knowledge and their sophisticated supply lines to bring food and equipment and everything, but. But the conflict is taking place in one country. The blood and guts are coming out of one group of people, but it's being amplified and financed.
Well, that's that's a sort of real-time example and a conflict that probably would have ended much quicker, right? Without any international support, probably would have been an invasion, territory taken, conflict complete. Yeah. Unfortunate for the Ukrainians, but that's how war functions. But instead, we have a propped up nation who's able to extend the war, therefore increase the body count. It ends up being a far worse situation than it would have been because it's become a pseudo proxy battle as a result.
Yeah. Now, on the other hand, if the war had ended quicker, why would Russia have stopped? They would have just kept going to take all those historical countries that they're always trying to take and reestablish their entire empire. And then we just have a bigger conflict in the end anyway. I mean, sometimes if people want a conflict, they're going to get it. That's, if China is really, well, it's not necessarily China, it's Xi himself has this peculiar idea that he absolutely has to, well, as you said, finish that civil war and take over Taiwan. I mean, if he's bent on doing that, it's not reasons of, these are almost unexplainable reasons, human reasons for doing this, whether it's pride or hubris or some kind of concept of, racial or societal You know what I'm trying to get here? I mean, China has no practical reason for taking over Taiwan. It's for some other cultural reason that they want to, finish that battle or bring everyone who was ever part of the, the historical Chinese empires under the rule of the one person. I mean, it also just made me think. I mean, this talk between America and Canada. Trump imagining, Canada should be the 51st state. I mean, this same argument, with Manifest Destiny or whatever, it's been going on since before Canada even existed as a country. I think we could have been the 39th state at one time, and then probably the 46th state. Multiple times it almost happened that the country of Canada, or as it existed at the time, was subsumed into the American empire as it expanded. And I wonder that, the whole is this is maybe a provocative thing to suggest, but open to discussion. Are Canada and the U.S. really just components of an unfinished civil war? The children of Great Britain and its cultural institutions. Maybe. I mean, we all came from the same colonial development, right? I mean, obviously there's French involved in Canada and there's some Spanish in the U.S., but I mean, anyway, that's just to get people to yell at each other. It is the fourth turning after all, right?
Yeah. Oh, man. Well, one thing you mentioned earlier, you mentioned Trump's going to go for a third term. He said that publicly. His administration has come out and said, yes, they're seeking legal grounds to run a third term. I think they're going to find the legal grounds. I think he's going to run, and then we'll have to wait and see what happens. And you can already imagine, I mean, everybody watching this, just, imagine with me what the sort of liberal media or Democratic Party response is going to be to that. It'll be this sensational, the dictator has arrived, he's crushing American democracy for good, trying to build a monarchy. All this, it'll be all hyperbolic like that. The reason I say it's hyperbolic is because, term limits are relatively new, and they were only implemented in 1947 during the last turning, right? And, FDR won 4 elections, right? Like, this is sort of, America has had no term limits a lot longer than they've had term limits. But so it'd almost be a reversion to the mean. And I think aren't term limits a bit anti-democratic anyways? Like, if the people want to keep a leader for 12 years, shouldn't they be allowed that privilege? And if that leader's so bad, then run somebody else and beat him. I mean, that's sort of democracy. And, we have that system in Canada, no term limits. We get leaders for 10, 12 years sometimes. And there's downsides to that too. I'm not saying it's like the better path, bar none, binary outcome. It's not. There's pros and cons to each, but, that'll be interesting to watch that play out for sure.
Yeah. And especially as you were mentioning earlier, I mean, as human beings, we all have a term limit anyway. And it's about an average of 82 years is for men. I believe that's the average lifespan. Maybe in the U.S. it's even less. So some of it will depend on medical technology.
Sure.
Term limit.
So I read Merchant Kings. I think everybody who's watching who watches my show, you'd love this book. You'd love it. It ties in the role that raw materials and resources have played in the shaping of our geopolitical chessboard today, the role in history, and how that puck gets passed, how, as Stephen mentioned, it was nutmeg, it was mace, it was pepper, it was pelts, it was furs. The development of South Africa with Cecil Rhodes and the creation of Rhodesia, which is obviously now Zambezi and Zambia.
That was all diamonds. It
was all diamonds.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a fascinating just corporate play, how he rolled up all the rights in both the Kimberley mine and the De Beers mine, and very strategic entrepreneur, deplorable in many of his activities, but as you mentioned, kind of a sign of the times.
Yeah, brilliant minds.
Brilliant minds.
Almost all these people are brilliant in their conceptualization of how to go about achieving their goal. We can argue whether their goal was good or bad. I mean, actually, good or bad is not even the right answer. We can argue whether it was moral or immoral, but I mean, that depends. Morality changes over time too. So
it does, absolutely, it does. Yeah. What's next for you, Stephen? Like, what's catching your attention? Is there another book in the works? Like, where's your head at right now?
Well, I mean, I am working on something different right now. I mean, it was only a year and a half ago, my book on the the massive railway, which was the largest railway in the world at that time, the CPR across Canada, the most technically accomplished engineering feat that had ever happened. Think about the complex geography. I mean, Americans had built railways 10 years before the Canadian ones, but their geography was very different. And the land to the south of Lake Superior is very different to the land north of Lake Superior. And we're talking almost 1,000 kilometers here. In the US, that's all kind of flat and reasonably good farmland. It was very easy for them to pound a railway through that, right across. They had it done 10 years quicker. The creation of the country of Canada was because it took so long to build that railway, which is what enabled the country of Canada to exist. There was no way to communicate back and forth between Canada at that time. And we all would have become, well, it wasn't the 51st state, and it wasn't the 36th either. It might have been the 43rd at that time. Without a railway, all of what's Western Canada right now would have been part of the United States. Now, they wouldn't necessarily have divided it up into states that same way. There was not very many European population of European background, and then was very zero. So when I looked at the technological development of that, like all the engineering feats and the development of dynamite that enabled it, and the political dreams of Sir John A. Macdonald and his ruthless ambition to basically conquer all this land from the indigenous people in order to achieve his ultimate goal, which was to prevent the expansion of the American empire into that land, which he then imagined would create the impetus for the American empire to expand into Ontario and Quebec. And all of it, he imagined, like a series of dominoes, would have completely fallen, which was what led me to this idea that you were mentioning, like maybe it's just an incomplete civil war between all these different factions based on the British Empire. Anyway, I started wondering, like, okay, so we had these railways now. We know that transformed everything. The economy was allowed to exist after that. Not allowed to exist. That's the wrong way of phrasing it. The economy could exist after that. And there could be greater populations going into thousands and thousands of kilometers of land. British Columbia would have, without connection to the eastern part of what is now Canada, would have, become to the United States. As you had mentioned, the United States purchased Alaska from Russia in 1867. They had already taken over the Pacific Northwest from the Hudson's Bay Company in the 1840s. And, the British felt themselves kind of being squeezed. And there was, what was it? 54-40 or fight. James Polk, Democratic presidential candidate, mid-1840s. Anyway, 54-40 is the latitude of southern Alaska. And, that was the election campaign. We're going to take over all of that land all the way up to Alaska. And so the only thing that enabled British Columbia to join Canada was this promise of a railway to connect them and have an economy internal to areas that weren't United States. Now, of course, that was controversial at the time, too, because British Columbia, I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here, but they used American postage stamps. All of their commerce and trade and travel was through steamships to San Francisco. And when the delegates from, Victoria, British Columbia, Crown Colony of Britain at that time, wanted to travel to Eastern Canada to meet with this country called Canada, a newly formed country of Canada, and say, maybe we'd be interested in joining you. They ironically traveled to San Francisco, rode American railways across the continent, and then came up into southern Ontario afterwards. And on their return, they traveled back through a different country. So it's kind of ironic, like, the delegates of one land traveling through a different foreign country to have a discussion with a different foreign country about whether they should join the other country, and then traveling back via the other country. Right. It's just kind of funny. Anyway, I started wondering, how did railways affect population demographics? All of a sudden there was, in Canada and in the US, millions and millions of people, primarily from Eastern Europe, were able to come out of Europe, where they were politically oppressed in areas like Ukraine and Poland and all that, all those entire regions down there now. And they came over, and many, many hundreds of thousands of people came and filled up all this land and became farmers, essentially. And,
they received free land for coming, right?
Yeah, absolutely free land. Now, of course, there was no government services at the time. There was no roads. There was one railway that you could get out there. So there's no roads. There's no government services. There's no economy yet. They were expected to go and create this economy. So they arrived there with a few bags of seeds and some domestic animals that they could bring with them on the one train that was carrying them out there. And it's sort of like, okay, here you are, get off the train. There's your free land. And of course, it recently, not in the too distant future, had indigenous people and millions of buffalo living all over it. The indigenous people, what was left of them after all the disease, the smallpox and the tuberculosis have ravaged their populations and the starvation. We're living on reserves, and there's a big, vast, empty prairie. And they called it the Great Lone Land because it seemed kind of empty. It didn't seem like a real land anymore. There was hardly anything on it. There was hardly any animals on it either. It was not a real living place, And they had to send them out. Okay, go get your axe out and your oxen. And when they talk about horsepower in that area, they literally meant horses.
Yeah.
Go on,
you're not wrong.
Dig up that grass and start planting some crops, and then see if you survive. How many turnips can you grow until next spring? And see if you starve to death or not. I mean, that's what government services was at the time, right?
Look, my grandpa was one of those settlers. He migrated from the States up to Saskatchewan, got his free quarter section of land in exchange for migrating. And my dad grew up in a little town in Saskatchewan with no electricity, no running water. In the winter, they'd hike down to the river, hack off blocks of ice, carry them back up, melt them. That was their water source, melted river ice. And that's my dad. That's not that long ago.
It's not that long ago. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. My dad's in his 80s, but that's recent history.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Yeah, I had a grandfather who was from Newfoundland, and he was telling me a story. I mean, he's deceased now, but his story was taking sailing ships from the northern coast of Newfoundland up to Labrador to do fishing because there were a lot of fish up there. So they used dynamite to blast their way out of the harbor earlier in the season to explode. Like they just go out on the ice, and some people would slip and drown when they're doing this, where they explode the ice and then get their ships out there and head up there. And they would stay there until the storms in November got so bad that they realized we better leave now or we're going to die. And he would tell me they get a storm on the way south again. And these are sailing ships. So imagine there's a freezing ice storm. Well, where does the ice collect? On all those hundreds of ropes and sails that are up there. So one of his jobs or people on his ship was to climb up the ropes in the middle of the hurricane or whatever it was with a hammer and just start smashing the ice off those ropes. Mm-hmm. Well, the ship's pitching around and surging through the ocean, and they're they're holding on for their lives as they smashing ice off of ropes as the ship, because if it got too heavy, it would just flip the entire ship over and they would all die. Yeah. You think, wow, this is someone who experienced that telling me this.
Yeah,
it's not that long ago. I mean, the world has just changed so much in that time. It's just incredible. So anyway, that's what I'm kind of looking at now. Like, how did all these how did the technology in the late 19th century enabled demographic shifts, profound demographic shifts in North America? And look at these different immigrant groups and how they got there and how they managed to survive. What was their life like?
Yeah.
Which, of course, is not that long ago, but it's so different than what we have now. It's almost like they would view our life as a science fiction movie.
100%. 100%. Well, okay, once again, I cannot give Merchant Kings a strong enough endorsement. It was so good, Stephen. I've since ordered The Company and Dominion, which is Dominion being your most recent book about the railway, which we talked about today. So if that part of the conversation interested you, all these books you can find on Amazon. I look forward to chatting again, Stephen. This is super fun. The best part about having a podcast is that when I read a book and I love it, then I can reach out to the author and try to have a conversation about it. And it's so fun. It's the best part of this business. So I really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, I really appreciate being here. I mean, this is one of the best conversations I had in a long time.
Awesome.
You're so knowledgeable and your brain is very nimble, and it's just awesome. Thanks for having me on this show.